Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army and a military historian. As an author, he is the author of the nonfiction book Born from War, A Soldier's Quest to Understand Vietnam, Iraq, and the Generational Impact of Conflict. His name is Patrick W. Naughton Jr., and my interview with Lieutenant Colonel Naughton will follow the note-taking sounds. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Naughton Jr., welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. Looking forward to the conversation.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yeah, so my name is Patrick Naughton, and as Aaron just said, I'm actually Lieutenant Colonel in the Army. But obviously, anything I talk about here is just, my personal opinion. It has nothing to do with the Army or anything like that. But I'm currently, still in the Army, Lieutenant Colonel, and I am teaching at the Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And I recently just released a book called Born from War. Um, a soldier's quest to understand Vietnam, Iraq, and the generational impact of conflict.
And you mentioned the title of your book, which is Born from War, A Soldier's Quest to Understand Vietnam, Iraq, and the Generational Impact of Conflict. Without spoiling too much of your book, what is it about?
Yeah, so the book is about, so my father, he was a Vietnam veteran, and then, I served in Iraq. And so the book is about comparing and contrasting, his year in Vietnam fighting there, and then my year in Iraq. And then, how his service then, influenced me to eventually join the army and, like I said, go to Iraq. So it's like a family story of two wars, told over decades that, have so many similarities that it's quite shocking once I did all the research for it.
Despite the Vietnam War and the global war on terror being a couple or so generations apart, what were some major similarities between the two?
Yeah, I mean the list goes on and on. I mean, everything from both of them were counterinsurgency fights. So in Vietnam, we're trying to defeat the North Vietnamese army. At the same time, we're fighting the Viet Cong in a counterinsurgency environment. And then, obviously in Iraq and Afghanistan, we're doing that counterinsurgency environment for both of them. So of course that's the biggest similarity. But there's all kinds of ways that we things that we did similar in both conflicts. We tried to train the South Vietnamese army in an exact mirror image of us, which is the same thing that we tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan. The way that we deployed troops, in Vietnam, we deployed soldiers 1 year at a time as individuals. And we thought that, that didn't go so well. So we thought we'd change that up for these current recent conflicts. And we deployed 1 unit at a time for a year. And both of them were did not were not successful. But the list just goes on and on. And the way that we did day-to-day operations, the way we interfaced with the media, the way some of the doctrine and techniques that we actually use on the battlefield for both of the conflicts. The list just goes on and on. And I really discovered that and really explored it in great detail in the book.
How did the Vietnam War shape national security policy here in the United States in the decades following the end of the war?
Yeah, it was called the Ghost of Vietnam. It had a huge influence on every single foreign policy decision that we made, every single national security discussion that was had at the highest levels of government in both the military and in the political side. And the way to shut down any conversation, anytime you were talking about, a foreign security issue or foreign policy or national security issue was, well, what do you want to do? You want to do another Vietnam, and that was the way to immediately shut down, any type of discussion from that point. So it was constantly there, and now, with Iraq and Afghanistan and the global war on terrorism waning, my fear is that it's now going to be the ghost of Vietnam with the ghost of Iraq and Afghanistan followed right behind it. So all of that is going to continue to influence all foreign policy, national security decisions, and an even greater impact moving forward.
How has the Vietnam War affected families here in the United States in the decades following the end of the war.
Yeah, so those soldiers who were killed in Vietnam, in my book, I interviewed a number of families of those soldiers that my father, who knew who were killed in Vietnam. And we're 50, 60 plus years on, and that hole at the dinner table, that hole in their hearts is still there. And they're asking the question, Vietnam, what was the point? What were we trying to achieve? Why did my not so much sons and daughters at this point, but their brothers and sisters is most of the ones who I talk to who are still alive. And so there's a lot of pain there, and there's a lot of struggle of trying to understand why we were there in that conflict. The same for families today in Iraq and Afghanistan who lost someone in those conflicts. It's that same pain and that same discussion that's never going to go away. As long as somebody has a memory of that person in their family, it's always going to be there.
Sometimes when someone who either is or has been in the United States Armed Forces writes a book, sometimes that book has to go through a vetting process by the Defense Department to make sure any classified information doesn't get disclosed or revealed in the book. Did your book, Born from War, have to go through that vetting process?
No, that's a great question. No, it did not because the bulk of the research is Vietnam and all that's, open source documents found in archives and et cetera. So all of that was in there. And then anything that I talked about in Iraq, I talked about it. I did not go into any great detail of any of the operations that I was on and so on, just so that I didn't would not have to get that review and make sure that I wasn't, divulging anything sensitive and so on.
How long did it take you to write Born from War from start to finish? And what was it like doing research about research for your book?
Yeah, I started from the first time I put keystroke to Word document was about 3.5 years ago. So it took a while, but there was some pauses in between. We moved across the country twice. We had a baby. I don't know. So, there were some times I took a couple months off to handle life and then come back to writing. But what was it like? I've written a lot of articles and so on before I wrote this book. But all of my history, all my articles were military history related. Everything I wrote on was World War II or earlier. So it was primarily archives, documents, old newspapers, letters, diaries, etc. But with this research, I talked to a lot of people who are still alive who served with my father in Vietnam. So it was a little bit different, because when you're writing about people who have been dead for, 150 years or whatever, there's really not a concern of I don't want to say hurting their feelings, but there wasn't there's not a concern of writing something that's going to make somebody upset or make somebody um, concerned, from their reputation and so on. So when you're dealing with live subjects, you've got to take all that messiness that comes with it, and they're telling you something bad about a comrade that they served with. You have to make a choice. Do I put that in the book or is it even worth it to disparage somebody like that? So it was very different from just focusing on archives to then interviewing live subjects and so on.
What were the easiest and hardest aspects of writing Born from War for you?
I think the easiest is that it wasn't, a strictly a history book, so it wasn't bound by, the historical, I guess, constraints of writing like a academic type book. So I could insert a lot more feelings and emotions and so on because it was about my family. So that was probably the easiest part of it, even though, it is historically accurate and that I researched and cited every single thing that I put in there. Um, but the hardest thing was probably just getting it right, getting the story right. Like I mentioned a second ago, talking to all these people who are still alive who fought in Vietnam and lost loved ones and friends and so on. Just making sure that I got it right for everybody and that it also served as a way to memorialize all of those people who were killed in Vietnam that I mentioned in the book as well.
Is your book Born from War independently, traditionally, or hybrid published?
Yeah, so when I decided to write the book, my goal was to try to get it, in the big five, obviously. That was my first thing. So I reached out to, all kinds of agents, had no luck there. So then my second step was to try to find a more independent publisher. And then if that didn't work, my final step was going to be to self-publish through Amazon, etc. But I ended up when I hit that second step, I submitted to a bunch of different independent houses. Definitely stayed away from the vanity publishers. But so I got three offers in the end. I got one from an academic institution, and then two from a independent publisher. And the one that I ended up going with was Casemate, and they are the biggest publishers of military history, military themed books in the United States and in the UK. So I was really pleased and honored to land with them and get my book out through them.
You have an upcoming book about women who served in the U.S. Army during World War II. Without spoiling too much about your upcoming book, can you provide a preview of that book?
Yeah, so no, that's a good question. Thanks for asking that. So that book is I've got a good skeleton right now, and I think I've completed about 5 chapters. So that's moving along pretty quickly, actually, a lot quicker than the first book was. And so what that is about? It's about a women Army Corps member who served on Eisenhower's staff in the European theater. So she was like the Forrest Gump of the wax in that she experienced or met every single notable person there, went through all kinds of different events, into including direct bombings from V1 and V2 rockets and so on. And so she went everything from D-Day all the way until October of 1945, so well after we defeated Germany. So I have all of her letters and her diary, and so that's the bulk of the book. And then after that, she moved to LA and tried to get into Hollywood, and a bunch of other things happened, which I'll save for for the book. But so it's really going to be quite a dramatic story of war and the impacts of the war on her, when she had PTSD afterwards and tried to make it in Hollywood and all the things she went through there. So it's really going to be quite an exciting book, and I'm really knee deep in all the research right now, and keep uncovering new things that she experienced and new people that she ran into, or events and so on. So I think it's going to be a really great book.
In addition to having written one book that's been published and another one that's in the works, you've written peer reviewed articles about history and national security related topics. What are some topics you've written articles about, and what were some of the journals that published them?
Yeah, so I've written I think over a dozen up to this point. The list I've got, let's see, Army History Magazine, Journal of American Military's Past, Joint Force Quarterly, Military Review, Naval History Magazine. Trying to think of some of the others. Interagency Journal. Um, yeah, there's a whole bunch of them, but I've written about just about everything: American Civil War, World War II, World War One, just about the interagency environment, ethics in war, a whole number of different things. If you go to my website, which is just patnaughton.com, you can get a link to all those journals. If anybody's interested in reading up on any of that.
I have one final question for this interview. As you're a military historian, what do you love most about being a military historian?
Yeah, that's a great question. The biggest thing that I discover, as I'm writing these articles, doing research for, the first book, and then now the second book, the thing that I find most interesting about it is how timeless service is. So, I could be researching about somebody in World War I, researching about somebody in the American Civil War, whatever it is. If you take away the politics surrounding the conflict, if you take away the uniform they're wearing, whatever weapon system they're carrying, and so on, you strip all that away, you find that the timeless experience of serving in the military is the same, whether you're a Roman legionnaire or you're serving in today. I mean, there's some core tenets of just serving in a military, being a part of a military organization, going through those things, and then trying to integrate back into society afterwards, and so on, that are just very timeless. And so that's kind of the most interesting thing I find about being a military historian is when I'm researching on these subjects, how I can immediately relate to, whatever they are saying, even though it's, a couple hundred years ago or whatever.
Lieutenant Colonel Naughton, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. Thank you for your service to America, and you were an amazing guest to interview.
No, thank you for having me. It was a great conversation. You have some awesome questions.
I had the opportunity to interview Lieutenant Colonel Naughton 50 years and a week after the fall of Saigon, and he was an insightful guest to interview. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.